and welcome to the Teaching Together podcast, where we celebrate and share the glows and grows of teacher life. I'm Grace.
And I'm Sierra.
Each week, we like to share some of the glows or grows that we are experiencing in our actual real lives. So, Sierra, do you have a glow or a grow for us?
I think, yes, I have a grow actually this week, which is a little bit different to normal. I am about to start teaching Stage 6 textiles, which is very exciting because I love to sew, if you haven't picked up on that yet. And so I'm really looking forward to it, especially from the practical side. I've been team teaching with my friend throughout this year, just more as like a practical aid in the classroom. But she's heading off on mat leave, and so I'm going to be picking up a bit more of her load. And so, yeah, I'm really excited because it's going to be a new challenge and a new subject and something I'm interested in and broadening my skills and experiences a little bit, but also just a little bit terrified of all the theory that I need to learn that, yeah, is going to be a bit of a growth challenge.
We always love a hidden growth inside a glow.
Yeah.
You know what I meant?
Yes, definitely. Because I'm keen for it, but I know it'll be a lot of work to sort of bring myself up to speed on that. But yeah, what about you?
So literally today, the day that we are recording this episode, I received the first finished copy of my semester 1 reports, which as a baby teacher is actually so delightful. To see my name there on the report as the classroom teacher and see the words that I wrote in their general comments and all the boxes that I ticked. And I just am so thrilled. And it honestly has not been nearly as stressful as I thought it was going to be to write these reports. I do only have 18 students in my class at the moment, so it's very small, which is great. But we were assigned buddies to proofread our reports before they go to our principal. And my buddy was really, really kind. She is a very experienced primary school teacher. And she was so kind and helpful and validating because she didn't have feedback on the structural quality of my work. It was all very nitpicky typos and things like, do you have a capital for this or not? And those kind of things that you worry about when you're writing reports. So I was so thankful that, first of all, that I didn't have to rewrite a whole bunch of stuff and that she thought they were good, but also that I was able to be kind of mentored by her in writing these reports. And then I had to give her feedback on her reports, which felt weird because I was like, do I know anything about anything? But then I thought, no, in another life, I would have been an editor of some description. I was like, I can do this. I could totally do this. And she was very thankful and found my corrections to be helpful. So that was great. So that's definitely a glow because I finished my first ever set of reports and I was able to write stuff about my students and, all those fun first class things that I'm enjoying because it's the first time. And then I get to do it all over again in 6 months.
Wow, I don't think many people would say that about reports, but good on you. Good on you. Well, over the last couple of weeks, we have been chatting about the GTPA and breaking down both of our reports, how we approached them and the types of evidence that we used, as well as sharing some of our top tips for just making it through that last grueling university assignment. If you know people in your world who are approaching their final placement, or you know that you have a prac student coming on board with you for their final placement, it would be really helpful to have these episodes on your radar, and make sure to send it through to those people who might find it useful because it's packed with loads of helpful info.
Today, we're going to be discussing one of the more controversial aspects of the teaching profession, homework.
Ooh.
Whether we're disagreeing about what to call it, who to give it to, or whether it even serves a purpose at all, teachers love to argue about homework. And in this episode, we'll break down some of the research into the efficacy of homework, its pros and cons, and our personal opinions and experiences. But first, it's time for tea. So, Sierra, what are you drinking today?
Well, I am trying a brand new tea today. It is a T2 tea called Wakey Wakey. And I bought it actually a few weeks ago from TK Maxx, which is like two of our favorite places in one segment, which is very exciting. And I have the sense that like the fact that it's called Wakey Wakey gives me connotations of it being like a breakfast tea, or that's what I was kind of expecting it to be like.
Yes.
But it's not quite like that at all. It's quite turmeric-y.
Oh.
And I'm actually really enjoying it. And I figured that it was a bit strange to be drinking Wakey Wakey in the evening, but I do need all the rejuvenation that I can get at the moment.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one.
What about you?
I am drinking my classic, which I think I was drinking last episode, which is French Earl Grey from Twinings with a hint of vanilla. And it is definitely not my hero tea, which is the French Earl Grey from T2, obviously. But it is definitely a close second, and it's getting me through while I get around to actually getting my butt to T2 and getting some more French Earl Grey tea.
Well, homework has been defined as work set by teachers that pupils are expected to complete outside of school hours. Another definition from the same paper, which is Homework, the Upsides and Downsides, emphasizes that the purpose of homework is to practice, reinforce, or apply newly acquired skills and knowledge to learn necessary skills of independent study. This definition is quite revealing about why we should be assigning homework in the first place, and I don't think many teachers would argue that this is usually the intention behind homework, but in many cases it can become something that teachers assign because they have to or they feel like they should, and students complete it because they have to, and that's just that.
We actually give homework in kindergarten to my students, but we call it home learning because we're not giving them busy work. We're learning, which I found so pretentious when I first heard it. I'm like, just call it homework. But it is really important at our school. It's part of our school culture to refer to things as learning and not work. And so it does actually fit with the culture of the school to call it home learning. And because they're in kindergarten, we encourage families to limit any home learning that they're doing to 10 minutes a night. And essentially the system we've got is that there's 4 teachers on kindergarten at my school, and we each take a turn creating this homework matrix where there's 9 tasks that kiddos get to choose from, and they might be going to the park and drawing a picture of 3 things they saw that started with the letter T that we're focusing on this week, or practicing your numbers to 20 while you play hopscotch in the backyard, or helping set the table, or things like that that are integrated into their real lives, and they're contextual because they're doing them, like they're going to the park and seeing these things and then drawing a picture and they're going, oh, I remember this real life thing that I saw. I know that tree starts with T because I drew a picture of it for my home learning that week, or whatever. And actually, what surprised me was that many of the parents in my class have actually told me that their children are excited about home learning and they actually enjoy completing it. They've said they love doing it, and I've had quite a few students, because we're getting into winter now and everyone's getting sick. I've had a few students who have been away for longer periods, and their parents are coming into school and dropping off their homework and saying, can we have more? And I'm like, are you sure? Like, just stay home, guys. But because I'm teaching kindergarten and we're teaching them to read and to write and to count for the very first time, lots of the activities we're giving them to complete are around those foundational skills, which goes back to that definition that Sierra read out before about practicing, reinforcing, or applying newly acquired skills and knowledge.
I think a lot of people who are maybe sit more on the no homework side of the fence would hear what you're saying and say, yes, I do those things with my kids at home anyway, and so I don't want them to have to do homework. I feel like that was maybe the sort of the household that I grew up in, my mum was very good at teaching through just normal life and family routines. And so I remember like homework being something that was not really, I guess, pushed, or I don't want to say not valued, but definitely I was doing my homework in high school more because I didn't want to get in trouble for not doing it.
Exactly.
And because I felt like I needed to do it rather than because my parents were saying, have you done your homework yet, or pushing me to do it. So I think they would have been quite happy for me to not if there weren't consequences for not doing it. So I actually find that I tend to sit more on the I don't give homework side of the fence, which is perhaps a little bit controversial. And maybe by the end of this episode, I'll be thinking more intentionally about whether I do or don't do that. And because it's also not entirely true. Like I do give homework, and I do from time to time I might give it like a passing phrase in terms of like, your homework for this week is to keep drawing and keep thinking about your design ideas, and just like, I guess, pass it off as something that I don't want them to feel stressed about, and that there's, always a set due date and there's set expectations around I must have it done by a certain time, and so I'm just going to rush through it. I also just feel like kids in this day and age just tend to be like drowning in homework and drowning in assessment tasks, particularly in high school. And so my stance has just always kind of been that I avoid giving it if I don't really feel like I need to. And I also find it really hard to maintain keeping up with the expectation around, well, if you set homework, does that mean that you then have to mark it? And do you have to collect it? And when should you check it? And what are the consequences for not doing it? And I just think in my first couple of years of teaching, I found that all too hard to kind of know what to do. And so I've just kind of avoided it as much as possible, which actually makes a lot of sense now after reading this article by Vicky Hallett, who is an education expert from Johns Hopkins University. And she talks about how teachers actually receive very little to no formal training in how to assign homework to students, meaning that we often just end up repeating what we remember from our own schooling, what another teacher recommended, or textbook suggestions, or just following school policy, which is a good thing to do. We're not saying don't follow your school policy, but some of these are not necessarily particularly well informed. And this is my biggest bugbear with all elements of teaching. When teachers just do things because that's what their teachers did for them.
Yes, I'm so with you on that.
Not because they know that it's effective. And sure, there are things that I do that my teachers did for me, but I'm confident that it's effective, and I've seen the research, or I've looked into it further, or whatever it is, and I know that it's good practice. And so there are things that we will see passed on from teaching generation to teaching generation because they are good. But if we actually stop and assess what we're doing, I think there's a lot of things that we would find that we do purely out of habit and purely out of what we've observed through our own school experiences without stopping to think about what's the purpose behind what I'm doing here. So I think this is exactly why I've, developed my particular stance on homework, is almost out of direct opposition for what my teachers did for me. I don't want to be imposing on students heaps of stress, hours of homework every night, being locked away in their room away from their family, just because they're worried about having to get something done that actually was maybe just busy work.
Yes. And I found that my homework experience was very much just busy work. And it's been very interesting learning to be a teacher in a completely different education culture to the one that I actually attended school in. Because when I attended school, it was very much you do work because you need to be kept busy, and if you do lots of homework, then you'll become smarter and we need the results. And it wasn't really about what is the point of learning. It was do well on this test kind of approach, which was really harmful to me because I was locked away for hours on end, especially getting into year 10, 11 and 12, constantly just spending every waking moment on something school related. And it wasn't effective. The way I was spending my time was not effective, and it did stress me out. And I can't believe that it didn't make me hate school because I loved school. Like, I love to learn. And I think that's just part of my personality. I love learning, which is part of why I became a teacher, obviously. But like, it really burnt me out. Like, I was a mess during my HSC year. But even before then, it was just, and there was lots of, you need to finish this activity that you didn't finish in class at home, as well as extra homework stuff. And I don't feel like the purpose of the homework tasks was ever really considered. It just felt like this is something we should be doing because we think that it'll make you smarter. And it just was so unhelpful, and it wasn't contextual. I wasn't talking to my family about what I was learning. It was all just like answering questions from the textbook, like at the end of the chapter, and just dumb stuff like that. And when I think about it, I get so frustrated for my past self, even though I literally graduated school 8 years ago and it doesn't matter anymore, but I get so frustrated because it was just such a waste of time.
Yeah. I think there's been a lot of research and discussion around what makes effective homework and how effective is it really. And I read an article earlier this week about, certain schools in Queensland that are basically vetoing homework and just want their students to go home and read. And like, I'm all for that as well. But yeah, there's a lot up in the air when it comes to homework. And I think at the end of the day, the research shows us that it's effective when I guess it's used on the right age group. There is a lot of conversation in the research to say that it's more effective for those middle and senior school years than it is for primary students. But I also think that maybe comes down to what we consider to be homework, like that matrix style of like, go and draw a picture of something that starts with T that you were describing doesn't sound like typical homework to me. And that's still like a really helpful reinforcement activity that a 5-year-old could be doing without making them stressed and crying at their kitchen table.
Yes, and I think that's really important to remember, that homework doesn't need to result in everyone crying at the kitchen table because dad's like, I don't understand this maths. It's completely different to when I learnt it 30 years ago. And your teenager's like, I don't get it. I just need to finish this question for tomorrow. Like, I love the idea of homework as something that reinforces a skill that's already been taught because it's an important skill and need to practice it. Like, I love that. Otherwise, like, what is homework for? What's the point of doing schoolwork on your own when you could be making mistakes? Your teacher's not there to help you. Mum and dad have no idea what's going on. Like, what is the purpose aside from practicing those skills and potentially, especially in kindergarten, having those conversations with mum and dad, or I always say the grown-ups in your house, about what you saw at the park and how it relates to what you're learning at school? Because often families want to be involved and they want to know what their kids are learning. And yeah, I love the idea of homework, either reinforcing a skill or just involving parents a bit more.
Jumping back to the Johns Hopkins article, one of the things that came out of the research that Vicky Hallett has done is that the really good homework assignments are the ones where kids interact more with their families. And when parents come away from it saying, I actually know what's happening in my child's classroom now. And it made me actually think about Standard 7 in the Australian Professional Teacher Standards.
Because Sierra's a massive nerd who thought of that. And when she said that, I was like, that is amazing. Gold star for you. Someone did their accreditation.
Well, I started teaching full-time basically at the height of COVID. I don't think I've experienced a time yet in my career where I feel very well engaged with parents.
Yes.
The the whole first 2 years really that I was teaching, parents weren't even allowed on site at school. So my interviews were via Zoom. All of my communication was via phone or email. And, that was still, I guess, an important skill and ways to work around how do you still sort of connect with families in this instance. But it was challenging in a way that I assume it hadn't really been for teachers prior to that. And schools are still talking about, executive is still talking about, coming out on this side of COVID. How do we get families back involved in school? How do we get parents back at school? How do we, create communities again in our schools? And so this standard 7.3, engage with parents and carers. I mean, if you're a graduate teacher, it's the standard that you're working towards is just simply understanding that there are different strategies for working effectively, sensitively, and confidentially with parents. And as you move up these levels, it's actually less about just knowing that engaging with parents is important, but working to establish and maintain those relationships with parents. If we are creating homework tasks that intentionally are designed so that our students are engaging with their family in their learning, that is a way that we are using a strategy to maintain collaborative relationships with parents in relation to their students' learning. So when I was reading this article, I just thought, oh, hey, this is actually probably something that is, I guess, an achievable way of building those relationships with parents in an environment where we actually, especially in a secondary setting, hardly ever see them.
Yes. And I think we were talking off mic before about how, because I'm teaching kindergarten and lots of these students are the oldest child in their family or the only child in their family, their parents are very involved. And I'm not a parent myself. I haven't had a child go through kindergarten, so I can't empathize, but I can imagine that you want to know that your child is getting a good education, and kindergarten is very foundational. And it seems that parent involvement gets slightly less intense as you go up the grades. I mean, it obviously depends on the parents, but it's the way that we do homework for my kindy kids I love, because a lot of it we say, have a conversation with whoever's in your family about this thing. And I think that is what the standard of homework should be. It shouldn't be write an essay about this or whatever. If it's just to reinforce learning that's happening at school in a way that you can monitor at home. Because again, parents are not teachers. And the Johns Hopkins article emphasized that parents should never be expected to teach their children because they are not trained teachers. We are professionals. This is a profession, and we shouldn't be expecting parents to teach their children. But if you have something like, for example, talk to your grandma about what school was like when she was at school and compare it to the way that you go to school now, that's something you can do orally and verbally at home. And then you can do it verbally at school as well. And the task is still being met, the learning is still happening, but no one wrote a huge essay about it. And honestly, they don't have to if it's homework. It does not need to be stressful. Have we said that enough? It doesn't need to be stressful.
It's also really helpful, I guess, at this point in our conversation to think about, well, we don't want it to be stressful. We don't want it to be busy work. So what then is the purpose of homework? Why are we giving it? In what context should we be giving it? How does it become valuable? Those sorts of things. Kathy Vatterott is known as the homework lady, and she's written quite a lot of information on homework, and a few years ago released the second edition of her book called Rethinking Homework. As I was having a read through it, I feel like for an Australian context, homework is actually very different compared to what they do in America and in some other countries. My understanding from what I've read through of her book is that a traditional view of homework, particularly in an American school, involves actual contributions to their grades, as opposed to it just being a consolidation activity. And she's proposed this new paradigm or purpose for homework, which involves a couple of different categories. One of those is pre-learning. So it might be that the homework task that you set is for students to go ahead and read an article so that in the next lesson you could have a discussion about it. What would maybe some pre-learning in a very junior context perhaps look like for you?
We haven't done pre-learning, I don't think, at all, but I can imagine if we wanted students, for example, we're going to introduce the letter K in the next literacy lesson, we could say, tonight at home, come up with 3 things in your house that start with the sound K, because students are already engaging in language with their families, so they should be able to hopefully hear the K sound at the beginning of like cookie or whatever.
And I feel like that could be a really interesting point for you to then come into your class and be able to differentiate between C and K.
Yes, which we had to do when we introduced K at the beginning of this week. And this actually relates really well to the next purpose of homework, which is diagnosis, kind of like an entry ticket, where essentially in this scenario that I just mentioned, I can also then immediately see how confident students are with their phonemic awareness in terms of, I can hear that sound, I can relate that sound to an object that I could see, I can remember those things and bring them to class, those kinds of things. And I think we don't do a lot of pre-homework in kindergarten, but I can definitely see there is a place for it. But I can imagine there might be even a greater place for it in the upper years for you.
Yeah, I think so. I guess it kind of comes along the concept of like a flipped classroom. I'm not sure.
That's what I was thinking in terms of like this kind of read this chapter before you do the lecture at uni kind of thing. And
yes,
the tutorial and whatever. Yeah.
Which I have, I guess, attempted at various points in the past and just feel like it's really hard to land. And Vatterott isn't saying that you have to do all of these types of homework, but is just laying out different approaches to homework that is purposeful. And so I think it also comes down to knowing your students and what they're able to do on their own and what the likelihood is of them actually coming back and having done that activity. If you're planning your whole lesson around the fact that everybody's read the chapter in advance and then 90% of them haven't read the chapter in advance, that can put you in a bit of a frustrating position.
I was literally in an excruciating tutorial where the lecturer had assigned just the most ridiculous number of pages that were unintelligible, like they were indecipherable. I could not understand them. It was for a conflict in modern Europe unit. So it was on all these different wars and genocides. It was all horrible. Anyway, 90% of us had not, I think actually 100% of us hadn't actually finished the readings because it was impossible to do so. And he literally was like, I can't teach you if you haven't read the readings. And I was like, yeah, but you've set yourself up for failure. This is too hard.
I think that's really important when it comes to those diagnostic and sort of pre-learning elements of homework. Another category of homework could be a checking for understanding type of homework, which Vatterott says is probably the most neglected type of homework, but actually the most valuable way for teachers to gain insight into student learning. So it might be that you ask a student to just spend some time journaling in the evening about what happened in their science experiment today and why. And then as they are actually just responding to that, and if you read their journal article later, it actually provides some really helpful insight into their level of understanding, or asking them to identify some literary devices in a short story shows how well can they identify those and how quickly can you pick up on them. And so checking for understanding homework can be quite simple. Doesn't have to be incredibly time consuming, but I feel like one of the reasons perhaps why teachers don't utilize it very much is maybe because it's a bit more time consuming for the teacher.
Yeah,
to establish an effective task.
And as you've been explaining it, it almost sounds like a type of formative assessment, like you're checking for understanding.
That's exactly what formative assessment is.
Yes, and you need to mark that and write it and make sure it's good and relevant to the content you've been teaching.
You have to assess the understanding.
And then you have to give it back to them with feedback, hopefully, which is the whole purpose of doing a task like this. Yes, and it can feel like you're just creating more work for yourself.
Yeah. What I do really like about this idea, I mean, from a maths perspective, obviously I'm not a maths teacher, but maths homework was one of the biggest things that I remember having to do all the way through high school. And the worst is when the teacher says, oh, complete this entire exercise by next lesson. And you're like, what? And I think maths homework was really the thing that sent me over the edge the most times.
Yes, agreed.
As a high schooler. But I cannot think of anything worse than having practiced a whole exercise incorrectly.
Yes, because it's so easy to do when you're doing it on your own and it's like 10 o'clock at night because you've had soccer training and you need to put your baby sister to bed and cook all the food and do all those things.
And read your favourite book.
Yes, the teenagers have to do. And you're like, you forget that one step and the example in the textbook doesn't make any sense and you're crying and then you go to school the next day and you're like, can you just give me the answers that you'd give? Let me copy your work because I just need to have it done. Does this sound familiar to anyone?
Well, this is the kind of well-being disaster that we don't want to create for students. But as I'm thinking about this, surely it would be so much more effective and convenient, hear me out on this, for teachers to simply say to a student, complete these 5 questions. And I'm not talking 5 questions that all have like 25 sub-questions, but 5 problems. They go away and work them out. They come back, they get those 5 questions marked, and the teacher checks for understanding. Does the student know how to follow this method or follow this formula or whatever? If in those 5 questions you can see that the student has successfully been able to answer those questions, then you should say to that student, okay, you've demonstrated mastery of this skill. Now go and practice the whole exercise. And maybe you're not going to put a time limit on it, like it has to be done by next lesson, because actually spacing and retrieval are really important parts of practicing and consolidating. And it's actually really unhelpful when maths teachers ask students to go and complete a whole exercise of 50 questions all in the space of 2 nights, because next week they're not going to remember how to do it. But if they go home, do 4 problems or 5 problems, stop, check for understanding, make sure that they're practicing it correctly, then they've got a week or 2 to complete the exercise and hand that in. I can tell you right now that that will be far more beneficial for your students' learning, because they're not going to practice it incorrectly and they're spacing their practice out, which is giving them greater opportunities for retrieval. So they're going to remember that process and that skill for a longer period of time.
Ooh, mic drop, mate. Oh my gosh.
Out of breath.
Are we illustrating to you, dear listener, how important the purpose of homework is? Like, we really need to understand the purpose of the homework that we're assigning if we want it to be good, beneficial homework. I hope we're getting that across.
The 4th category of homework that Kathy talks about is practice homework. And the big takeaway here, which I've already just mentioned, is that there is absolutely no point setting practice homework when our students can't yet demonstrate that they've understood or grasped the skill. So we have to check for understanding first. And it's far more valuable for them to go through a process of spaced practice rather than mass practice. So don't set a whole exercise that's due the next day. Give them time to space it out. The last category of homework that she talks about is processing, which is really just when we set homework tasks that help students to reflect on the concepts that have been discussed in class, like thinking of new questions to ask or applying their skills or knowledge that they've learned, synthesizing information, or sort of doing a big picture task. We might see this kind of homework through a long-term project, writing some sort of original piece, whether that's, a piece of music or a poem that sort of shows this culminating understanding of everything that's been covered throughout a unit. It also might just be, though, having conversations, again, like we've said, with people in your family about the kinds of things you've been learning and what are some takeaways, and sort of, as you articulate that, be able to process what they've learnt and how that applies in real life. When I was studying for my HSC, I used to write myself questions from each syllabus dot point.
Of course you did. I love you.
Then write the correct answer with my notes in front of me on little flashcards. And then I'd sit with my pop for hours and he would ask me the question and I would give him the answer. But then he'd ask me like more questions about it that weren't really on the card. So like if I had a biology question that was like, I don't know, what is photosynthesis? That wouldn't have been a year 12 biology question.
I really hope not, because I know that.
But I would give him just the straight up formula. And then he might say, oh, but how does that part of it work? And blah, blah, blah. And he was just the type of person who would like prompt for more information because he liked to feel like he knew what I was talking about. And so we'd actually just have really good discussions. And even though that was totally self-directed, I feel like that really falls under processing.
Exactly. And lots of us will process things by talking about them. And I know that often I would go out to my mum and just say, like, I'm really stuck on this thing. Can I just talk at you for 5 seconds? And in 5 seconds or 5 minutes or 5 hours or however long she let me talk at her while she was cooking, most likely, then just the act of discussing it with another human being made it make more sense.
Mm.
Yeah.
So all of this is fabulous. We know that, homework has some benefits and there's different kinds of homework that we can assign, but how do we assign good homework? Kathy Vatterott gives us a few things to think about when we are trying to design a good homework task. The first thing we have to pay attention to is that it has clear academic purpose. And she also provides us with some really helpful statements that we can share with our students to help them to see the purpose behind what we're doing. She makes it really clear that it's essential for us to be explicit with our students about the purpose of the homework. So not just that we understand it for an academic purpose, but that they understand it. For older students, she suggests things like, this homework will allow you to practice something you have already learned. Or another statement like, this homework will help me to check whether you have understood something that we learned in class this week. Or this homework task will allow you to pull together several things that we've learned across the term. And those kinds of statements are really helpful for highlighting for our students what the purpose of the task is.
And for younger students, there's similar sentiments, but in, kid-friendly language. So, the reason for today's homework is so you can practice doing something you learned in school, or so that I can find out if you understand what you learned today. And I can see myself literally saying that to my kindy kids, or so you can think about and write about what you've learned, or to show you something we will learn about soon, which could be, hey, my kiddos love when we learn a new letter because, they all know the alphabet, but they love learning a new letter like officially. And we actually still haven't learned the whole alphabet yet, guys. We're almost there. But
so much joy to come.
There is so much joy to come. But I can imagine them getting so excited when I say, hey, we're going to learn the letter Z this or next week. Your homework, which I wouldn't say to them because I give them a written matrix that they go through with their parents, but it could be, find some things that start with Z, or, do some reading with your mum and dad or grown up in your house and write down any words that have a Z in it because they know what a Z looks like, and that's then encouraging their parents to read with them, et cetera, et cetera. I thought that those statements were actually very helpful and really authentic to the age group they were designed for. Like those ones for younger students, I could say those verbatim to my kindy kids, and I think they'd understand what I was talking about.
The other thing that she flags as being really important for us to consider when we're designing good homework is efficiency. The tasks we set should help students to reach the standard without wasting their time or energy. And we actually know that students are actually really time poor. I am just blown away by the number of sporting commitments and music commitments, as well as just being part of a family and all of the commitments that brings. And sometimes we get sick and they just need to play and veg out. And I don't know, there's so many things we don't want to waste their time. You don't like having your time wasted. Don't waste your students' time or their energy. So an example that she gives of this is, do they really need to read the whole chapter? Or do they really need to read the whole book? So for English, I guess, again, I'm not an English teacher, but for every novel study or book study that we ever did in high school, we had to read the entire book. Is there potential for you to pull extracts from books that still allow you to teach the content or the themes from the story without expecting students to read the entire thing in a short period of time? Again, reading is one of those things that I think is really important and is probably could be considered separate to homework, but maybe can you look at how you can make a task more efficient in a way that frees up their time, but also allows you to still teach what you're trying to teach?
Again, the purpose of your homework will dictate the form that it takes. And so if you're thinking, well, let's go with the novel example. The purpose of this novel study is for students to really get an understanding of theme in novels. Potentially, it might be helpful to read the whole book because theme is often something that's a bit broader. But if you're looking at literary techniques, then extracts would be so helpful, particularly in like year 7, 8, 9. And like there are things like Cliff Notes and Schmoop and all that wonderful stuff for that reason. But also audiobooks come to mind, which I think for some students, especially now in the age of podcasts, when everyone has a podcast, every man and his dog has a podcast.
Someone said that at school the other day and I felt like really targeted.
But potentially an audiobook might be a little bit more accessible because you can listen to an audiobook while you do other things as well. You can, and you should be, adapting the task that you give for, well, first of all, the needs of your students, but also the needs of like what you're trying to teach them. I am a trained high school English teacher, which is why I jumped on this novel idea, because you can think, well, okay, what do my kids actually need to know? Do they need to read every single page of this book to understand the use of metaphor? Potentially not. But again, if it's something like character development or like the journey of a character throughout the entire narrative arc, then potentially, yes, you would need to read the whole novel, which then lends itself to, well, what novels are we choosing? Why are they 75,000 pages long? Why don't we go with something like The Great Gatsby, which is like less than 50,000 words? And thinking about the HSC, the texts themselves were actually, in terms of length, relatively accessible. Like we watched films, we did poetry collections. So you really need to get to the heart of what am I trying to do? What kind of tools do I have? How can I adapt them? Yeah, what impact do I want this to have on my students? What do I want them to learn? And that will impact the type of homework that you give them.
I'm so glad you mentioned audiobooks because especially as an adult who enjoys reading and learning and building my knowledge of things, but also feeling like I'm just incredibly time poor, I have really come to love audiobooks. And I remember at school, audiobooks kind of being like only a thing for students who had IEPs.
Yes.
Not that I would have known it was called an IEP then, but, you know, like it was not something that we all had access to. But actually, how beneficial would it be? Like, how many kids get read to these days?
Yeah.
How beneficial would it potentially be to have everyone have access to the audiobook? Then they can determine whether that's more efficient for them or not. But even to have, like, to be able to read along.
And like the multisensory learning approach of listening and reading, it's going to get in there more.
And when they come across tricky words, they're actually going to hear it read for them and be able to go, oh, that's what that was.
Yes, and having, especially in the younger years, having fluency and expression demonstrated to them. Beautiful. Like you could do so many things with that. You could have kids, I'm now riffing, but you could totally have kids like acting out what they're hearing as like an activity with the audiobook. Like, anyway, we could do a whole thing on a whole other topic, but we're not going to do that because we're talking about homework.
And efficiency. At the end of the day is we want our tasks to help our students to reach what we want them to reach, the standard we're trying to achieve, without making them feel like we're wasting their time. The last two things that she mentions on how to design good homework tasks are consideration of competence. So the tasks should actually have a positive effect on the student's sense of competence, which also comes down to motivation. When we've spoken before about self-efficacy, and self-efficacy is a student's perception of their ability to do something. It's not necessarily a true reflection of their ability to do something, but it's their own sense of their ability to do something. if a task that's been set feels unachievable, it is going to have a flow-on effect on their motivation. And you can bet your bottom dollar that that kid is not going to finish their homework if they think that they have no ability to do it.
And that is why I did not do maths in the HSC.
Vatterott highlights how tasks should be personally relevant and customized for students to promote ownership. And I guess when students feel a sense of ownership over their work, or their learning, I should say, and when they feel like there's a sense of choice and option in what they're doing, they're far more likely to be more motivated, which is going to have a positive effect on their self-efficacy and all these things that we just talked about. You can very easily, through the design of a task, positively or negatively influence a child's self-efficacy and their motivation towards something. So I really like those ideas of the matrices, even for older students. And I think when you actually take the time to plan out a matrix as a teacher, it might help you to actually think through a purposeful, intentional homework task rather than just sort of getting to the end of a lesson and feeling like, oh, we didn't get as far as I thought we would today. So, hey, everyone, your homework is to do this.
And the idea of a matrix is there's a certain amount you have to do, but you don't have to do the whole thing. It's not like do, question 5A through to Z. You don't have to do 26 examples. You pick the ones that you want to do. And if it's too much, it's too much.
Well, I feel like that time has gone really quickly, but we are at the end of our episode and at the end of our discussion on homework for the time being. So we hope that this has been a helpful, summary for you of some of the research and given you a little bit of direction about how you can be planning purposeful homework for your students. It doesn't have to be every day. It doesn't have to be every lesson, but in conjunction with your school's policy and your own, perspectives on homework, hopefully these points can give you some really clear direction on what you can be doing to make this the most beneficial for you and for your students.
As always, we are everywhere as some version of Teaching Together, the podcast, on Instagram, on Facebook, on whatever podcatcher you decide to use. If you listen to us on Apple Podcasts, please leave us a written review because we would love to read those. And everywhere else, give us 5 stars if you think we deserve them, because as we always say, we'll love you forever. Bye!